welcome to Moral Politics. I'm your host, Bill Alford. With the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act, high schools now offer an education and a fast track into the military. Literally, uniformed military recruiters patrol hallways in high schools, contacting 15, 16, and 17-year-old minors. Most boys that age don't shave, drink, or vote. Just how do military recruiters contact high school students, and who's overseeing the access they have to America's still impressionable young? Moral Politics will put its lens on those two important questions tonight. Joining me, I have special guest Todd Boyle, a Navy veteran, a father of two, and the co-founder of Washington for Truth and Recruiting, an organization that disseminates objective information to parents and students about military choice. Todd, it is a very great pleasure to welcome you here tonight.
Thanks, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to it.
Look, to begin with, what motivated you to co-organize Washington for Truth and Recruiting?
Well, you have to look back in 2003. The Iraq War came over the horizon, and I was really shocked by that. It awoken all kinds of thoughts about back the Vietnam era. And our particular high school had 10% of its students going into the military, according to the Seattle Times school study. And my boy was 16. I was upset about that, and we were already having a fatality by 2004 of one of our students. And so it just was enough to motivate me.
But let me ask you another question. Is the military, can it be a good choice for some students?
Well, you could say that it comes out well for many people who go in the military. I'm not sure about characterizing it as a choice. I've been thinking about this. They would have to know the outcomes, a little better for it to be a good choice. It's somewhat of a gamble in any case. And certainly for many people, it comes out very tragically.
Well, we mentioned earlier the No Child Left Behind. Can you tell the viewers just a little bit about what that act entails?
Oh yeah, the No Child Left Behind is a huge act. It has a couple hundred pages, and when you read about it in paper, it's about curriculum. But there are two provisions in there that affect the military very much. One requires schools to allow recruiters into the school under pain of losing their federal funding. Specifically, they have to allow recruiters, military recruiters, the same access that are provided to colleges or to employers. Okay, it's not very complicated. And then the other part is that schools have to turn over all the names and addresses and phone numbers of all the students unless they opt out.
Now, is that act responsible for basically turning high schools into recruiting mills?
No, not really. The military had been in most of the high schools in America for a long time anyway, because we have a volunteer force, and that's where the students are, that's where the recruits are. In fact, the Department of Defense complained around 2001 that 20 to 25% of the high schools were not allowing them on to do recruiting. And so the Republican Congress passed the provision requiring all the schools to let the recruiters on there.
We got the No Child Left Behind Act, and it gives access to high schools, further access. You've said that there's always been access. But does this get administered differently depending on school district and by school itself, really?
Oh my goodness, yes. There's great inconsistency. Some schools have many recruiters present, and some have none. That's a sore point in our district. For example, we had 10% of the students reported going in the military from Lake Washington High School, and 0 from another school, similar school, high school, the International School, and then 1 or 2% at that time from Juanita High School and Redmond High School. That's not unlike other districts. Basically, the recruiters want to set up a recruiting mill in there. They want to have regular, recurring contact, and they want to be present in the teenagers' world in more than one place. They want to kind of become part of the background, and that's where they really start to take off and get a lot of recruits.
But it sounds like there's a fairness issue that here we have No Child Left Behind, and it's run differently in different school districts and in different schools. 10% recruitment in one school, 0 in another. Does this cut down the socioeconomic line? Are we finding that this is a poverty draft and an ethnic draft?
Yeah, there's been an endless discussion about that. In fact, at the beginning of the Iraq War, The African American cohort who were in the military, joining the military, was about double represented compared to their fraction of American population, whereas by now they're about the same as other recruits, as far as I understand. And it seems to be more a function of income. There's a definite connection between income of the recruits and who goes in the military. And then there's also this connection between how intense they're recruited. There's no question that that's the biggest determinant, is how intensely they're recruited.
But some of those recruiters are not just the uniformed military. When you say it's the high school, and there are a lot of high school influencers. The coach being one of the famous ones, the popular student.
Oh yes, this is the Army. In fact, has the famous recruiting manual. I think it's 350-13. If you go out on the internet, you can find that pretty quickly. And it outlines a whole plan of marketing in the high schools to develop influencers. That would be a counselor, a coach, a principal, a teacher, and students, popular students, football players, Boy Scouts.
I've heard that military recruiters have access not only to the hallways, and they literally do patrol those hallways in uniform, but they're found in the cafeteria, they're found at the prom, they're found at the athletic events. They're basically everywhere.
Well, again, this is very common in schools where the principal or the teachers are of a conservative or pro-war mentality, and so it is kind of arbitrary. It's kind of capricious, really. A district ought to have policy at a district level. Really, the state ought to have policy at a state level to ensure more uniformity than that, rather than leaving it to the preference of the teachers or the principal.
Speaking of teachers, now, what about parents and teachers? Are they influencers? Are they actually safeguarding these children from?
Well, that isn't a big part of our counter-recruiting, efforts. The parents they're the ones who ought to be counseling their students, their teenagers, and we don't make any effort at all to try to change parents' head on this. What we're concerned about is that the school as an institution should function in a responsible way. It ought to have policy that's a matter of conscious decision by the parents and by the school board, instead of being handled, in a dictatorial manner without public discussion or, by principals.
Are you saying that there's some heavy-handedness going on?
Around the state and around the country, we have the red districts, and particularly around military communities where the school board is populated by pro-military people who just are about getting students into the military. And if you try to raise there are many discussions on the email lists about parents who find themselves in these districts and they are not even allowed to have time at the microphone.
Now, does this tend to be certainly the red districts we all know, but there are red districts within even blue states. But do you find that there's some socio-demographic related to that? Is it like Republican families push their kids into the military more than, say, progressive families?
I'd be really outside my actual expertise just because I don't get around the state. There are, I think, 290 school districts just in this state. There are 20,000 school districts around the country, and 4 million students turn 18 every year. This is a vast tide of humanity, and I think the diversity, even in our school, it's just amazing. There's so many beautiful kids of all different. The things they say are just amazing and thoughtful. And
so, as far as you know, there's really no evangelical upbringing or a military family or a right-winging family that indicates whether a child is more inclined to listen to recruiters and actually sign up. Maybe the point here, maybe before they're really able to make that decision.
I really think there is a connection between what church a person is raised in and how they, it's a well-known fact in America that there are dominionist and evangelical, some parts of evangelical churches that are more nationalistic and more interested in joining the military than some, the extreme opposite end of the spectrum. You have the churches like the Quakers and so forth that are quite anti-war. I was raised in a Catholic tradition, at least up until my early teens.
I'm just curious as to whether you told me earlier that there are 4 issues that you've noted, I think, as part of Washington for Truth and recruiting.
Truths is the biggest problem because that removes the freedom of choice from the student. They, like anyone else, if they don't know what they don't know, then they can make choices. Their freedom of choice is preempted, and basically they're being, they might as well be drafted. So untruths includes omission of information and misrepresentation when those are material enough to preempt the decision process and make a person make a decision different than they would if they knew the truth.
So what you're saying really is that the recruiters are leaving something out. They're deliberately stepping over some important point.
Oh my goodness, yes.
That you, in fairness, should be told.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's no question. You could ask any veteran if their recruiter told them, the entire truth, and quite often, But there isn't even a checklist. If they at least had some rigor to their method, that they had to, to cover certain material, then you'd have a starting point. And we've talked with districts trying to get the districts to have a complete checklist so that the students knew at least, a fair chance of what omissions. Okay.
So there's no requirement that they tell you the whole story.
No. In fact, they quite often use emotional appeals, and appeals to teenagers at that age have a larger than average interest in social acceptance. They're starting out fresh in society, and they need position and they need respect. And they also have insecurity. They've never lived on their own. They don't know, good heavens, how am I going to make a living? I haven't got a job. And the recruiter's telling me that I'll never get a job if I don't go in the military because I'm not going into college. Half of the students aren't going to go to college. Maybe 60%. In some a large fraction of students don't even graduate from high school. So there's a huge cohort of students who have great insecurity about their future and can't get a job right now. So working on these emotional pitches, the recruiters pull them in. You see, they're not dealing with a rational decision like a checklist of what your pluses and minuses are about.
But now you're talking really there about actually twisting or misrepresenting. Not only do they not tell you things, but what they do tell you is basically not presented as accurately as an honesty.
That is correct.
That it should be.
That is correct.
How about, I think you also mentioned deceptive methods, something like the hard sell. Are we seeing a hard sell take place in high schools to get these vulnerable youngsters to sign up for military duty?
Yeah, we call these methods, unethical methods, and they're also illegal in many states for used car salesmen, for example, bait and switch, for example, or there's truth in advertising law here in the state of Washington. So you have things like a good cop, bad cop routine where they'll try to pressure a student, particularly when they get close to the time when they're going to get on the bus. That's when some of these things start to come out, like, hey, you told me that you were going to join now. What kind of a man are you if you don't follow your own word? If you don't start honoring your own word now, then where will you be in life? And so there's all this kind of business. This is what I would call an unethical method for a teenager who's never lived on their own.
I know that the military has faced some recruitment shortfall. I know that the African American segment in particular has wised up to the fact that military is just a fast track to Iraq or elsewhere. And I think we might see more pressure like this.
Yeah, well, in the ideal world, then the student would have a clear picture of their statistical risk, their risk of death and injury compared to other industries, which is massively higher than other industries. I mean, it's just way off the scale. There are some dangerous industries in America, mining and so forth, and being in the military is way over the top. And then their likelihood of being sent to the battlefield. If you look in the recruiters' pamphlets, they do just, you can join and be a musician, you can join the sports team, and some of these things are outlandish.
Now, there's been a lot in the news about some of the recruiter crimes, some of them sexual misconduct being the one that makes the headlines, but there's much more than that.
Well, there are, we need to have math literacy here. There are about 17,000 recruiters, I don't know, more or less, and so you're going to have some incidents of crime and of improprieties. And without having a systematic reporting on these things, it's hard for the reader to make good judgments. There are about 500 recruiter improprieties reported, 500 or 600 every year, and these are things like lying to the recruiter on basic things like, you know, you're only going to be in for 1 year, or we guarantee you're going to be in Germany, and also lying to the Department of Defense. This student, you know, has no criminal background, or he's not on drugs. When the recruiter knows that, quite often the recruiters have to make their quota, so they'll cheat. You know, they'll get people in who shouldn't be in. Those recruiter improprieties are one category. The military does not report systematically on serious crimes, sexual abuse, the things like assault or theft or whatever. And these appear to be about 100 per year, according to an AP report released in 2006, who got a Pulitzer Prize. You know, this is very difficult. You submit Freedom of Information Act to multiple branches of the service and try to get information about recruiter crime. But one last fact, if you Google for recruiter rape and minus football, so you don't get football recruiters, then there are more than 1 million hits on Google. And you can read for the rest of your life and never get to the end of the list, because there are more coming up faster than you can read them.
Yeah, I know that this is pretty vulgar. I think that there's a policy that's come out called No One Alone. So recruiters cannot operate alone when they contact female high school students because of the increase and the ramp up in sexual misconduct.
I think the institution is responding, and that's not surprising because they really have to respond. They're also beginning to respond on rape in the military, which 30% of women in the military were reporting being raped in the 1990s, and not a heck of a lot was done about it until quite recently, if at all, really. It's a very difficult problem for the military to deal with. But we saw after World War II, the military dealt with racism and actually got ahead of industry and ahead of in certain parts of the country on racial equality. So we know that it can respond, you see, and it's just a topic, it's something the students should know before they join the military.
Well, how do the different branches of the service differ in their recruitment? Is the Army recruiting the same way the Air Force is, or the Navy, or the Marine Corps?
You know, I'm not a great expert on that, although I've seen the Marines do operate quite differently. Their recruiting techniques are offline. You can't go in and read their policies as you can for the Army or other branches. We know that they try to recruit a year younger. They try to get 17-year-olds and make teenagers into soldiers if they can. And they work with families much more frankly. You know, I think they are bringing, primarily they're bringing the teenager into combat. And
that brings up a good question. Where are the parents in this mix? Are we finding that they basically do not know their rights to protect their children? Were they intimidated by maybe the patriotic drumbeat? Is it ignorance, or is it both? Or are parents getting active and looking into what the No Child Left Behind Act really entails and not being misinformed?
Well, these are great questions. You've clearly done your homework on questions to ask. Many parents, when their kids arrive in high school, especially if it's the first son or daughter, they don't even know the recruiters are in the high school. And then after it takes them a year or two to figure out whether they care. And then with more time, they get more experience. Then they tend to become more involved and warning their teenagers what they're getting into. Even if they're supporting of the administration or a particular war, they get much more concerned about what's going on because they know that there's teenagers have their judgment isn't up to this kind of thing.
I know that the Seattle School Board is holding a vote. I believe it's August 1st, and they're going to decide to limit the number of visits that the various military branches, the 5 branches, I think they throw the Coast Guard in there, to 2 times a year. And I think they're also going to control the sites where they can set up. I think they're going to, all the recruiters are going to be located in one facility, one location, and that's it. You come 2 times. It'd be like a job fair, that type of vote. Are you following that?
Yes, there are 2 different policies. There's a controversy going on. The Seattle Schools is planning to limit, as far as I understand, is probably going to pass 2 times per year for each of the 5 branches per high school. And as far as I understand, these visits will be in the high school. And the other side of the issue is many of the radical students, not even radical, but the students who are involved in recruiting issues, what they want to see is all college, employer, and military recruiters off campus once or twice a year in a big recruiting fair someplace, so that the recruiters aren't in the high school at all, walking the hall or having contacts and so on. And so apparently they're going to be marginalized. But the Seattle district and about 5 or 10 other large districts is really going through a historic social change and recognizing the role of recruiters in high schools and having time and location restrictions, having an active discussion about how they should be, what's responsible management. The school board has the responsibility to parents and to society to run an educational institution. The schools are for education.
That's right. There you go. Schools are for education. Now, continuing on this, how they recruit, are they recruiting at the school, at the child's home? Are they calling and contacting the child at home? Are they recruiting to the parents? Or are they catching them off campus, out of the home as well?
Well, we see the recruiters off campus in Kirkland. I'm sure they're on the streets everywhere teenagers congregate. But almost everybody I know in high school was getting calls from recruiters because they have the whole name list. Even if you opt out, they're going to get a copy of the school directory. There's no law against somebody giving them a copy of the school directory. I don't know how common that is, but it's quite common. It happened in our school.
What does it mean to opt out if your name is not taken away from recruiters?
Well, the recruiter, I don't believe there's a policy that recruiters have to go and find out who has opted out. If they get a name from somebody, they're not going to run down and see if the person has opted out. They got a name from someplace lawfully, and so they call up the name. They're under pressure. They need to develop a conversation with every teenager, all 4 million of them.
If you opt out, can you restrict calls to your home?
That's a good question. All I know is that people who have opted out, there are just constant reports of parents who have opted out or students who have opted out who get calls anyway. And I think, in some cases, high schools or districts lose track of that opt-out. In many cases, the opt-out is recorded in 1 year and then it's not present the next year when the next list is printed out. Or they may have already gotten the student's name last year, and by the time they get the opt-out, there's just many a slip between the cup and the lip.
Are we seeing parent-teacher associations getting stronger on taking a stance in terms of at least overseeing the recruitment in their various schools?
Well, we did in Garfield High School, but I think that's probably the exception around the country. I found that PTSAs are very active in the elementary school, somewhat active in the junior high, and quite inactive. In fact, we almost disbanded our PTA at Lake Washington High School for lack of attendance. They had three mothers agreed to co-president to keep it alive and limping down through the year when I was there.
Is that lack of parent-teacher interest related to anything in particular?
I just think it's societal change. We're in unique circumstances. There's been an information revolution. There's an ongoing change in social mores.
Now, you mentioned Garfield High. You want to tell our viewers just a little bit about that? I know that they tried to limit access to their students. And was that do you know if it was a result of some excess of pressure or just a sentiment that took place in that school?
The person, I think her name is Amy Hagopian, who was a mother of a student at Garfield High, was involved in the PTA, and the PTA board, the whole PTA voted on a measure requesting recruiters not to come to Garfield High. I think that's what their measure was. Of course, it isn't binding because the school district makes those decisions rather than the PTA. But it got national news, and that poor PTA became the subject of all kinds of national attention.
We're running out of time, and we need to now tell our viewers basically what can be done. Let's just hit a few key points. We know that there's some skew here. It's not always fair. Some schools are, sending more recruits to the military than others, and it is administered by districts and principals and school influencers. And if they've got a penchant for the military, then your kids in that school are going to have more information or misinformation on the military. How would you like to see that addressed? What would you like to see done there?
Well, first of all parents as well as teenagers should be informed about the operation of recruiters, their methods, and how they operate in the school. And once you become informed, I'd like to see more parents go down and speak at the school board meeting and speak to their principals, requesting time and location oversight. In other words, recruiters shouldn't be allowed to just come in and walk around our high school and develop relationships or take students into closed places. And they shouldn't be in there more frequently than other types of recruiters. Schools are for education. I also think that even if a district allows recruiters to have access to the students, there's still a problem with the untruths, which is completely unaddressed by even the most progressive school districts like Los Angeles or Seattle or Philadelphia or New York. Literally, nothing's being done about the untruths. They omit the whole character of war and military service, and instead they substitute these sales pitches that it's a great way to advance your career, which it clearly isn't.
How can that be dealt with? Do we basically have somebody watching the recruiters as they go about recruiting?
Well, the career counseling should be done by the employees of the district. That's why we have career counselors. I know they're overworked. They ought to be funded better. There ought to be more career counselors. Only career counselors have ethical guidelines, to work for the benefit of the student. What you don't want to have is a salesman in here with a conflict of interest who has a particular goal, and he can hoodwink these teenagers who are under 18 and they're in a public school.
Now, under 18, they can't really sign up until they are 18, is that correct?
Exactly, but most of the conversations are grooming, and it's really in nature of teaching or indoctrination because they can't sign up anyway. They're just trying to warm the kid up and make him believe certain things.
Todd, this has been a real delight having you on. I want to thank you very much. It's a great service that you are pursuing. Washington Truth and Recruitment. That's www.watir.org. People can go to that site, learn more about what you're doing. It's just a real pleasure to have you here.
And I want to thank all the 20 or so other people who are involved in this work around the state of Washington for working with Washington Truth and Recruiting. And I'm not the only one.
We're off.